Command.
Good morning, Captain. You look chipper.
Thanks, Mike. I feel fine, but you look a little pale. Tough flight, or were you up late?
Neither one. As one with psychic powers, you already know about my excellent day and evening, so I won't elaborate, and I am not pale. Thanks for your concern.
My powers and eyesight have become fuzzy over the years. Details need clarification.
I discovered the secret of your psychic powers yesterday. Your eyesight was apparently good enough the day before to read Georgie's desk calendar restaurant reservations for us. Do you snoop around in her office on a regular basis?
Of course not. I just stopped by to pay a bill. She wasn't in, so when I left my check on her desk, I couldn't help but notice your name on her calendar for Fisherman's Inn reservations. I am not a snoop.
I see. You just stopped by and couldn't help notice? I believe you, but there are millions who wouldn't.
So, Mike, what were you doing in Georgie's office last night?
I'll leave the details of the evening to your snoop power. The flight went well, though there was no lift, so I landed early.
Sure, to have more time to shine, shave, and shower for your big date.
Shall we move on with your story and adjourn to the park?
I suppose so, but your story has become more interesting.
For someone who has achieved levitation, that is an amazing comment.
Shh, hush up, Mike. Remember, there are some real snoops in here with their hearing aids. I hope you haven't whispered our little secret into Georgie's ear.
No, of course not. Would I want her to shift her spotlight to a naval aviator who can levitate?
Good point. You wouldn't stand a chance. So let's keep it that way, and I'll stay out of your flight path. If anyone is to be let in on my flights, I want to be the one to do it.
Unless you lose control and go streaking across the sky over Heritage Pines some Sunday afternoon during a garden recital.
If that happened, I'd just keep going over the horizon. Let's go to the garden.
So, on with your 1970 story, Captain. Did you find a cozy off-base apartment and settle down to life ashore again with Nazira before beginning the business of training for the next Vietnam cruise?
Pretty much that way. My command tour got off to a slow start because we initially had only 6 A7s assigned and a limited fuel budget.
Budget? You had to manage a budget? I thought DoD wasn't bothered with such trivia during a war.
Few appreciate that DoD is one of the best managed organizations in the world, despite its size and complexity. Although Navy squadrons are junior cost centers, financial management, along with authority and responsibility, is delegated to the lowest command levels.
Without airplanes or money, what did you do about training?
I figured we could fly our budget with 4-day weeks. So rather than sit around, I gave everyone Fridays off and suggested they spend weekends with their families somewhere away from Lemoore. After all, they were going to be away and working 24/7 for 9 months in a combat zone. So there was no question of Navy getting its money's worth out of them.
You had the authority to shorten the work week?
Probably not, but no one objected. Amazingly, the maintenance crew volunteered to work the number of people necessary over the weekends to get our planes ready for the Monday flight schedule. It worked out that morale and aircraft availability was very high. Of course, as our deployment date approached, we soon enough had a full complement of airplanes and funding. The pace picked up with training deployments to Nevada, Arizona, and Constellation. 3-day weekends were history, but no one questioned that either.
Did you have other leadership challenges?
I explained to the men why what we were doing in Vietnam was important and correct. If nothing more, we were defending the lives of our comrades in arms on the ground. I offered to excuse from the squadron anyone who disagreed. I probably didn't have the authority to do that either, but bless their hearts and thank the Lord, there were no takers. A few weeks later, one of my senior first-class petty officers got in trouble after drinking too much at the enlisted club, called the black manager a nigger, and pulled a knife on him. So, Some level of Navy judicial procedure was called for, possibly a court-martial. The petty officer was a dynamic, high-profile leader in our maintenance department, so this was a test in the men's eyes. As a Z-Gram supporter, how lenient would I be?
I remember that your father, like many old-time sergeants, believed in physical and verbal abuse instead of formal judicial punishment.
True, my father had a unique way of terrifying men with just words and looks, which worked for him. There were stories of men being taken out back and roughed up in the old days, but I never heard of that during my service. Formal non-judicial punishment, NJP, procedures were time-consuming, formal, and complex, so they took more patience and intelligence. However, it was far more even, fair, and understood. Modern sailors were more educated and enlightened than their predecessors, so physical discipline was counterproductive, not to mention illegal.
So what did you do?
Lacking father's temperament, I called the petty officer before me at captain's mast, which was the least formal level of NJP, with just the CO and the accused, plus selected witnesses.
No lawyers?
No, but the accused had the option of declining mast in favor of a court-martial, where legal representation was optional. However, punishment options were more severe, including incarceration. The captain's mast advantage to the accused was the limited degree of punishment permitted, fines and/or reduction in rate. The petty officer, who had a 9-year clear record, admitted to the charges and was appropriately apologetic. Nevertheless, I fined him $60 and reduced him in rank to second-class petty officer, which removed him from his authority and leadership position in the squadron. Severe humiliation for one of my more prominent men, but I felt that threatening the club manager with a knife, using the N-word, was unacceptable, especially for a senior petty officer in a squadron leadership role.
What were the effects of your decision?
My sense of it was that the men agreed that the petty officer deserved to be taken down a notch. Several months later, when he asked me to restore his first-class stripes, I declined. To my knowledge, that was the end of the matter. There were no other judicial proceedings during my tour. If we had been aboard ship, NJP, along with much of the squadron CO's administrative authority and responsibility, would have shifted to the ship's departments. So I was glad for the timing of the beginning of my command tour after the cruise. Indeed, I am way out of date now. I believe that all judicial procedures are administered externally by JAG officers. By the way, I want to mention that my father had once been busted in rank for an offense early in his career, and there was no doubt about the lasting lesson that was for him. Another bump in the road for the squadron during my CO tour was failing a nuclear administrative inspection. Somehow, a routing slip attached by a paperclip to a top-secret document had gone missing, which had the signature accountability of everyone who had handled the document. The Chief Petty Officer Inspector aggravated the issue by going out of his way to be excessively nasty and gratuitously aggressive with me, gesturing to poke his finger in my chest, exclaiming that there wasn't a damn thing I could do to him. Apparently, it pissed him off that I wasn't upset by the incident. After all, it was only a routing slip, which was no doubt somewhere in the pile of documents. The document itself was intact, so there was no cause to consider the matter a major breach of security. In other words, the chief was such a pedantic pissant, puffed up with authority, that it even seemed possible he removed the routing slip himself. So I waited several months to distance myself from the emotions before I sent a personal letter to his boss, Commander Naval Air Pacific, documenting the chief's disrespectful behavior and recommending his reassignment from inspection duties. Apparently, mine wasn't the only complaint. He was fired.
That must have been a well-written letter to not sound like sour grapes, Captain.
It was, but I can only take credit for initiating, editing, and signing it, since it was masterfully drafted by my crackerjack admin officer Rex Wolf, who witnessed the incident. Rex was a perfectionist with paperwork, so we made a game of it. He bet me a martini for each document prepared for my signature, which was error-free. I agreed, providing he would owe me a martini for each error I found. When the score became 42 martinis in my favor, Rex threw in the towel to preserve his yeoman's morale. Rex was also a colorful aviator who had a penchant for lighting farts at social functions, which of course would have been applauded in fighter squadron society. His writing talents were also handy for drafting our bids for squadron awards. The Blue Diamonds were a shoo-in for the Safety Award, since we had completed 3 combat deployments, including our transition to A-7Es, without an aircraft accident. We also completed the mission training requirements with high scores for competition in the E for Excellence Award. However, we did not receive either one. Since my admirer, Commodore Tully, was in the endorsement chain, I believe he sabotaged our nomination.
Hard to believe that a senior officer would be so petty as to punish such an outstanding squadron because of an unjustified personal gripe with the CO.
Not if you knew Tully. Later, I wasn't sorry that I inadvertently pissed him off once again. The more A-7Es began having bombing errors out of limits. I was certain that the avionics people had learned incorrect maintenance procedures in training, but there was little chance of tracking down the problem before our imminent operational readiness inspection without stirring up a lot of defensive denials. I proposed getting LTV factory assistance with Bill. He did not want to be involved, so I proceeded on my own. LTV was working hard to sell A-7Es to the Swiss Air Force, so I pointed out that when our inspection bomb scores were publicly revealed to be no better than earlier model A-7s, sales would be difficult. The effect on LTV management was immediate. Their electronic sweep team was upon us en masse that weekend. Tully had not been informed because he was in the midst of moving and was enraged that 30 factory civilians were descending onto the base without his approval. Tully's attitude was that DoD contractors were untrustworthy and up to no good, albeit he chose not to convey his anger to me himself. If he fussed at my boss, Gus Egert, CAG did not pass it along, perhaps because the desired results were achieved. Our outstanding bomb scores resumed, and no one got their toes stepped on for faulty maintenance procedures. Only a martinet like Tully would ignore the positive results. Fortunately, I encountered few other naval aviators like him.
A good thing you weren't working directly for him, considering how determined he was to get at you.
You're right, Mike. As it was, pissing them off told me I was doing something right.
It's really fortunate that your somewhat cavalier short-timer attitude toward your Navy future worked out so well for your squadron tour.
You could say that, Mike, but the attending risks that went with the job made long-term planning unrealistic. So my focus was independent of future intentions and more about the job at hand. I readily went down the yellow brick road with the opportunities Aunt Jean presented and enjoyed being in a position with the authority to make a difference. For me, there was no higher achievement for a naval aviator than to lead a squadron into combat. Moreover, After having struggled along with just average flying ability for 14 years, I found my stride. Flying seemed more natural, comfortable, easy, and fun. Even though I was 38, a ripe old age for a carrier pilot going off to war for a fifth tour. For example, during the Air Wing deployment to Fallon, Nevada, prior to carrier ops aboard Constellation, I had the good fortune of winning the Air Wing Top Gun bombing competition trophy.
Practice makes perfect, or was it Nazira's positive influence?
Both. I bet a sense of well-being and accomplishment above my highest hopes. Nazira was a jewel. Other than getting over the rough spot about my kids, she was totally charming, adaptive, and supportive, shore-based or on cruise. I should mention, however, that during that Fallon deployment, CAG had a mid-air collision with an A-3 tanker while in-flight refueling during a 30-plane practice Alpha flight formation I was leading. CAG ejected and was picked up without injury, and the tanker landed safely with minor damage to its right wingtip. Gusp had flown along as an observer to grade my flight for E competition at my request. On his own, he decided to take advantage of a rendezvous delay by the A6 flight for his unplanned refueling. The accident board gave me contributing factor because I hadn't briefed him for that.
How ridiculous to be so obvious in making excuses for CAG.
Of course, Mike, so obvious that Ray Charles could have seen it. As usual, however, nothing was ever said about the accident to me, and Gus later made Admiral anyhow. So I put the accident out of mind entirely.
You were very fortunate, Captain. How was the Air Wing transition to life aboard ship? If my count is right, that would be your third deployment aboard Constellation, so it must have seemed like old home week for you.
There is little distinction between Navy ships below decks, and there's nothing about conduits, pipes, and gray steel walls which resemble anything you would call home. Still, I had spent so much time at sea, and Connie was such an excellent carrier, that it felt comfortable to be aboard again. The move back must have gone well because I remember little about it, except a few incidentals. I was at lunch in the wardroom in port in San Diego when Chaplain Schmidt briefed the ship's executive officer on a forthcoming burial at sea for the remains of a retired officer. The family was to be present with a number of friends and wished to have the ceremony conducted from the flight deck. Schmidt reminded the XO that since offshore winds in Southern California were typically light and fluky, it would be difficult to maneuver the ship to be certain the ashes would drift away from the ship. Therefore, it would be prudent to conduct the ceremony from the more sheltered hangar deck closer to the ocean. After weighing the options, however, the XO decided in favor of the family's wishes.
Uh-oh, I can see where this story is going. Did you observe the event?
No, but it must have been quite a sight. At the exact moment of scattering the ashes, a zephyr softly and gently enshrouded the assemblage with the remains and drifted the length of the flight deck.
Ah, yes. The best laid plans of mice and men oft-times go astray. The dearly departed must have relished giving the family an unforgettable farewell from the other side.
Good for him. His kin should have known better. It is no small matter to put an aircraft carrier to sea for the sole purpose of such a minor event. Burials at sea for retired members should not be a permitted option, just as the practice of taking up valuable real estate in perpetuity with graveyards should cease, not to mention the primitively painful ritual of viewing remains.
I agree. Cremation is much more simple, practical, and inexpensive. A friend once told me his interesting experience of witnessing a cremation. May I share his account with you?
Sure, let's hear it, Mike.
My friend Jim once had an ex-Navy fighter pilot friend, Fred, who was living alone in Colorado dying of cancer. So Jim went to be with him for his final 3 months and stayed on afterward to tend to the cremation, memorial service, and estate settlement. Fred had been devoted to Indian lore and wished to be cremated with his bear totem. That led Jim to gain permission to witness the entire cremation procedure. I can't do justice to Jim's very detailed and moving description, so I'll just relate the highlights as I recall them. At the appointed time, Fred's remains were delivered in the heavy cardboard casket, which was to be put into the crematory. When Jim asked if the totem was inside, the mortician opened the box to let him see for himself. Jim said Fred's eyes were open, as clear blue as ever, and the bear was in his arms. The box was closed, placed in the oven, and Jim was allowed to turn up the flames. After several hours, the flames were turned down and the doors opened to remove ashes and consolidate the larger remaining bones, including most of the skull, in the center for further burning at a greater temperature, which Jim initiated by pushing a button ironically labeled Afterburner. Thus, Fred was launched up the chimney into space that night for his last flight.
Did Jim dispose of the ashes too?
Yes, I'm glad you asked. Even the afterburner did not reduce the large bones to fine ash. Those were pulverized to smaller bits and were later scattered by Fred's girlfriend from his horse at his ranch high in the Colorado mountains in the company of other close friends.
Thanks for telling me that story, Mike. It makes me appreciate that cremation is much more appropriate for aviators than burial. I had the honor of participating directly in the memorial airborne scattering of cremains for an aviator friend, but the background is involved, so I'll wait to tell it. There is also an option offered by the Neptune Society, which has undersea artificial reefs on both U.S. coasts for deposit of remains. The Society also offers the option of offshore ceremonies for scattering remains from small boats.
Those sound like excellent options for a crusty old Sea Dog naval aviator, afterburner up a chimney in smoke, and his remains stored in Davy Jones' locker. What could be better?
Right you are, Mike, so I hereby charge you with making it so when my time comes. You may consider it compensation for inheriting the Shamangal.
More than fair, Captain. I shall be honored on both counts, in the event that I do not predecease you, of course.
Well then, you better start taking better care of yourself. Georgie can probably shape you up. But let's try to finish this book before we go to Davy Jones' locker. I saw Nazira off on her flight to Hong Kong, and Constellation set sail for our readiness inspection in Hawaiian waters. The Blue Diamonds did well in the inspection. However, the rest of the Air Wing and Ship Department's marginal performance resulted in a generalized shotgun message of criticism from the Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, directed to all hands aboard Constellation. Since the Blue Diamonds had done well on the inspection and were unjustly included in the blast, Rex Wolf and I once again drew our poison pens to draft a personal protest message response directly to the Admiral, inviting his attention to the Blue Diamond's excellent performance on the inspection and outlining VA-146's other outstanding accomplishments.
You say that you responded directly to Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, bypassing CAG and Connie's CO.
That's what I said. It was my personal response to an injustice which did not involve others. Rex arose to the occasion in superb form, and we drafted a brilliantly balanced masterpiece message which I did not discuss with anyone. If my response was to have dire repercussions, I would take the brunt alone. We were as good as any squadron ever got, and damn it, we were going to war. It was my responsibility to not take some staff, desk jockey's unjustified shotgun criticism without calling him down for it.
Well, Captain, I have to say that you were extremely fortunate to have an outstanding writer like Rex to interpret your words to higher authority for you. What happened?
The immediate response from CIN CPA CFLT was that he cancel his blast message and ordered all copies destroyed. Then I received the Admiral's sincere personal message of apology. I surmised that the blast message had been drafted and released by his Chief of Staff without clearing it with his boss. I heard that CAG and Connie's CO were highly pleased with the outcome, which accomplished some good in restoring morale throughout the ship. But of course, they said nothing about the matter to me.
You were sort of sailing off with your own Navy, weren't you, Captain?
As I saw it, I was a team player, enjoying the authority and responsibility entrusted to me without having someone holding my hand or looking over my shoulder. In other words, I enjoyed the independence, but understood the risk of having been given all the rope needed to hang myself. The only mild chiding comment I ever got was from CAG, who ribbed me once about a lack of humility. As a fighter pilot, I considered that a compliment. The humble folks I've known had a lot to be humble about.
But the good book says the meek shall inherit the earth.
Earth. Yes, and it also says that the earth will be destroyed by fire next time, so inheriting it may be the reward to those who don't go to heaven. In any case, I soon demonstrated an abundance of humility. But that's a long story, and it's near lunchtime, so let's save it for the next chapter when Constellation reports to Yankee Station again. Okay?
Sure, Captain.